Helter Skelter, Lobianco, Sharon Tate, Charles Manson. These are names from the late 60s in Southern California, a time of terror, of heinous and violent crimes. And the subject of our episode today, thanks to my guest Hadar Aviram and her new book, Yesterday's Monsters, she looks at the experience of the Manson family, not so much from the perspective of the crimes they committed, but how it is that decade after decade after decade, they remain in prison and create, through the experience of their parole hearings, what she calls the illusion of parole. What this says not only about the Manson family, but what this says about how we treat violent criminals, what we expect from them once they are in prison, and is there any real prospect anymore of their release from prison to become productive members of society. A really fascinating, I know I say this all the time, I do know I say this, but this really is something I know you're going to find fascinating and that you will enjoy. So stay tuned for the next episode of Good Law, Bad Law. I'm going to start today's conversation with two questions that my guest today includes in the preface to her new book, Yesterday's Monsters, The Manson Family Cases and the Illusion of Parole. And those two questions are, do we regard violent criminals as irredeemable? Who decides and how? That is just exactly the kind of stuff we love to talk about on this program. And I want to welcome my guest to the conversation, Hadar Aviram. Hadar, welcome to Good Law, Bad Law, and thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
I really enjoy, I was saying to you before we started, I've been really looking forward to speaking with you and recording this episode ever since we scheduled it a number of weeks ago. You are the Thomas Miller Professor of Law at the University of California, Hastings College of Law in my hometown of San Francisco. And as I mentioned, you were the author of this just published book. I mean, you put Charles Manson in the title and I'm in. I have to know more. But tell us about yourself a little bit and how did you come to this topic, which of course uses the story of the Manson family and the murders that were committed in Southern California in the late 1960s in the name of Charles Manson, but you're using this to get at some much more broad and important issues in our criminal justice system. And so tell us how you came up with this approach and this idea.
Sure. So my work in general looks at the criminal process through social science perspectives. So I will do empirical work, sometimes experimental work on all stages of the criminal process. And my first book, Cheap on Crime, which came out in 2015, was looking at the way the financial crisis impacted punishment in the United States. Mm-hmm. So what happened when we realized that having 2.4 million people in prison was no longer economically sustainable and how we went about trying to change that after 2008. And one of the things that I found out when I was working on Cheap on Crime was that most of the reforms that were supported by the public, both in California and in general in the U.S., were reforms that for the most part addressed nonviolent criminals.
Right.
So for the most part, the public was finding it in themselves to say, well, if somebody's been convicted of a nonviolent drug offense, then maybe they don't need to be in jail. But none of these reforms really tried to tackle the difficult question of, do we really need to lock up every violent offender? Are all violent offenses the same? If we lock up people for violent offenses, how long do they need to be behind bars? Why are we locking them up? Would we be saving the money if we release people that even if they did terrible things, they're no longer a risk? And those questions were not really part of the big reforms that started happening after 2008. And I became increasingly interested in how we deal with people who commit these violent crimes. And I thought to myself, well, who would be the quintessential group of people who gets the least amount of support or sympathy from the American public? And how are they being treated sort of behind closed doors? And that, of course, made me think of the Manson family, who have had, cases that are internationally thought of as sort of the epitome of violent crime. And I started looking at them, and I thought to myself, wow, this is an interesting prism on the parole process, because while these cases are unique in a lot of ways, they're also pretty mundane in a lot of ways. And the more I learned about these cases, the more I realized this was a really good way to introduce the public to an aspect of the criminal process that people know very little about, which is the parole system.
Well, if we know anything, and it's funny because when I think about the issue of parole and violent crime, I do think of the Manson paroles because, every now and then it seemed, I know he died just a couple of years ago, but for years, here and there it would pop up. Charles Manson is facing the possibility of release from prison through the parole process. And you wouldn't really hear much about what that process was, how it works. But always there'd be the reaction of, what? How this they can't let this person out of prison. What are you talking about? So, but there are other people that are not as notorious, but who also committed, terrible violent crimes, who do come up for parole. And so it is important to understand, because it not only gets at questions of the individual we're talking about, do they meet the conditions of parole? But I think as you lay out in your new book, it also begs us to think about questions like, what is the point or what is the goal of long-term imprisonment for violent criminals?
Exactly.
So
exactly.
Yeah.
And in fact, when people ask me, why did you pick these folks? Why didn't you pick, somebody more sympathetic? Why didn't you pick a poor person of color with a case that's, less notorious to make these points? The answer I have to say is always, the story that Yesterday's Monsters has to tell is so compelling, and the process that I've exposed is so Kafkaesque, that I will get you to feel empathy for these people, and your empathy from then will extend to everybody else. If you can find it in your heart, regardless of whether you think these people should be released or not, because that's really up to any individual, if you will find it to see the process through the perspective of the long-term inmates, you're going to see that the points extend more generally to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Now, Manson died, I think it was in 2017, but
That's
several of the others who were part of the Manson so-called family are still serving life prison sentences in California.
Yes, out of the original 7 people that were convicted of the series of crimes, we're talking about 4 murder scenes and 9 victims altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody was mixed up in the same murder, so some people were only involved in one crime and didn't even know at the time of the other crimes. But altogether, we're talking about 7 defendants involved in all the cases, out of which Susan Atkins died of a brain tumor in 2010, Manson died in 2017, and the remaining 5 people are behind bars. 5 of them have been finally recommended for parole just in the last couple of years, but the governor always reverses.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. So, and again, these were not just murders. These were, at the time, such heinous, gruesome, bloody, gory, violent murders. They really terrorized Los Angeles and California, and for those who were paying any kind of attention, all over the world. In fact, you talk about growing up in Israel and in Tel Aviv, and even you had awareness of it after the fact. But as a young girl in Israel, these were murders that carried such prominence around the world. People were scared.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of this is the historical context. Joan Didion was writing about the murders at the time, and there's this widespread perception, and largely I think, and we're probably going to be talking about Vince Bugliosi's book, Helter Skelter, which many people learned about the Manson crimes from, largely because of this book, but for other reasons, there's this widespread perception that Manson killed the 60s, basically.
Yeah.
That this is the crime that awakened people to the fact that the 60s were not about peace and love, and that there was more sinister stuff going on. And this is partly why these cases were so instrumental, not only in changing the law in California, but also in changing public opinion about punishment. And one of the greatest ironies of this is that there's basically a circular process going on, because while these cases are serving as sort of the cautionary tale that changes the face of punishment in California, they then in turn are subjected to what happens through those changes, and you see this in the parole hearings themselves.
Well, and we need to get into that, but I mean, it is fascinating to just pause on the power of what happened in I was a child of the 60s. I always say that my parents met at Berkeley, and were sort of pre-hippies, like early 60s. And then I watched this documentary few weeks ago on the music that came out of Laurel Canyon in the mid 60s, which was definitely just a small window of time. Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills and Nash and many others. It's got a real innocence to it, as well as incredible creativity. And then bang, you hit this point in as we come towards the late 60s, when things really do start to turn violent in a lot of different ways, and then perhaps culminating in this not just criminal phenomenon, but almost a cultural phenomenon that the Manson crimes represented. So it's an incredible time.
Sure, and what's disconcerting here is just how close they were to the musical mainstream.
Yeah.
Manson had written a song for the Beach Boys, and this is definitely part of the story, and part of why I think people felt so afraid and ill at ease in LA in those times.
Well, and of course the Beatles record the song Helter Skelter, so they were also aware of what was going on, and probably there was a rebound effect from that.
Well, he actually took the name from the Beatles.
Of
the
course.
Beatles recorded the song unrelated to it, and he liked the song and made up the Helter Skelter because he was inspired by the Beatles song.
I'm such an idiot. You're absolutely right. I got it totally backwards. But same point anyway. Okay, so now that we've kind of digressed down the lane of musical culture in the 60s, what is this... what does this tell us about, or why is parole, I guess, the way to try to understand what, or at least to ask the right questions? What are we to make of how, as a criminal justice system, we regard the most violent criminals, and how we punish them, and what we expect to come out of prison? Why does looking at the parole process, which frankly most of us know next to nothing about, why is that the way to look at these issues, do you think?
So I think looking at parole tells an interesting question, because it's just what happened to parole in the last 50 years is basically a microcosm of what happened to punishment in general in that period. Because here's the thing, before the mid-70s, punishment in California and in other states as well was very much modeled around the concept of indeterminate sentences, which is to say, you would come before a judge, you're convicted of a robbery or, whatever, you're convicted of an offense, and the judge says you're going to get 3 to 20 years. So there would be a very large range, and you would go into prison. And after 3 years, after the minimum of that period, of that range comes up, you would come up before the parole board, and there would be a bunch of professionals sitting there with suits and ties, psychologists and social workers, and they would ask you questions to try to determine if you've rehabilitated and you're good enough to go to society. Some of our listeners might remember these scenes from the Shawshank Redemption, where Red comes up before the parole board, the wonderful movie about Shawshank Prison, and they ask him, have you been rehabilitated? And he says, oh, yes, that's God's honest truth, and they deny him every time.
Yeah.
And and that would be the scene, and there was a lot of critique about that system. So people from the right said, you're coddling offenders, people are deceiving the parole board, and they're getting out. There was some critique that the decision when to release people was arbitrary, and of course there was some racial discrimination component to it. And so around the mid-70s, we shift to a system of determinate sentences, where except for a very narrow group of cases, almost everybody gets a sentence that is set either by the legislature or by a sentencing commission, and basically what you get is almost to the day what you serve. So this comes with laws called truth in sentencing that require, for example, that you serve at least 80 or 85% of your sentence. So very little is left to chance, and essentially what you get, which is a function of what the prosecution charged you with or what you agreed to at a plea bargain, is the time that you're going to get.
Well, it's very little is left to chance, and very little is left to any evaluation of the individual as an individual person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And a lot of this comes from the fact that in the mid-'70s, both politicians and the public really lose faith in the idea that there's this kind of, professional class that toils in obscurity like a bunch of bureaucrats who work in therapeutic professions that can tell, what's going on. So there's a loss of faith in the idea of rehabilitation, in the idea that people can determine if you're rehabilitated. And then there's this sense of despair that if we can't rehabilitate, let's at least give people what they deserve. So that's what happens, and that means that at least in 14 states, they abolish parole completely. They do retain parole in California, but it loses a lot of its bite. And they basically limit parole only to cases of people that are doing life with parole. So all people that are convicted of homicide and a very small handful of other serious offenses like kidnapping. And these are the class of people that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So before 1978, and this is another important point because a lot of people are wondering, well, why would the Manson family come up for parole at all? Like, why wouldn't they be, if they're not doing the death penalty, why wouldn't they be on life without parole? And the answer is that in 1971, all the defendants in the cases that I talk about in the book were sentenced to death. But in 1972, the California Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional. And as a consequence, they commuted all the sentences of those people. They're now colloquially known as the class of 72. They commuted all the sentences to life with parole because life without parole was not in existence yet. Life without parole would only appear in the California law books in 1978, so much, much longer. And the fact that it got created at all, and the fact that parole became more difficult to attain, and in fact most people, the vast majority of people, are denied year after year, is largely because of the cautionary tale of the Manson family.
Because they just made it into this small window of time. I mean,
exactly. And we have to keep in mind that in the 70s, when these sentences are commuted, in general, sentencing in the United States was much more lenient than it is now. So it was not rare to see somebody doing time for a homicide crime, for a murder, and getting out after 10 or 15 years. In the Manson family cases, it was not outlandish to be, concerned or to think that at least the women might be released after 7 or 8 years. The first parole hearing is only 7 years after they're convicted. So at least the victims at the time, the memoirs that they write about it, the victims saw this whole thing as an uphill battle to keep them behind bars because there was real concern that they were going to be let out.
Well, and as you point out in the book, Hadar, the advent of victims' rights and the voices of victims in sentencing and presumably as well in parole processes, that didn't exist going all that far back, and that becomes an important check on those seeking to get out of prison after even serving a large part of a sentence.
Yes, to a great degree. I see what happened with the victims as part of the bigger process, which is it's hard to talk about punishment as sort of a right versus left situation politically. I think it's perhaps more, it makes more sense to look at it as two different forces or two different constituencies, right? On one hand, you have these sort of old school bureaucrats that were working in the rehabilitative system, the psychologists, the social workers, the correctional counselors, like all these people who are just sort of immune from public critique because they're sort of just toiling in obscurity inside the prison. And they're saying, we have the tools, we have the knowledge, we can tell, who can get out and who can't. And on the other hand, we have these political forces that are rising that are about, looking at crimes through a more emotional lens, through a fear lens, through a lens of, what has high emotional valence. And there we have the rise of politicians. We have the emergence of victims, as you mentioned, which the first Victims' Bill of Rights in California is from 1982. And then, the process of involving victims in this process just continues until Martys Law that comes on the stage in 2008. And at the same time, we also have the growing power of the governor who gets a veto over parole in 1988.
You mentioned Martys Law. What was that one?
So Martys Law is a proposition that the California voters approve with a fairly high majority in 2008. And ostensibly, it's a proposition about victims' rights. Ostensibly, it's about giving the victims, more ability to speak up in the process and to have representatives and the like. But in fact, that part of the proposition, unbeknownst to the voters, is largely duplicative of things that were already happening in California. So there already were victim rights advocates in DA's offices. People, largely the rights there are duplicative of what was going on in 1982. The big change was a change in punitiveness. So Martys Law also established longer times between parole hearings. And the idea is that if you are denied parole, you have to wait a presumptive time of 15 years before you even come up again. The fact that people come up much quicker is because this is really unworkable. 15 years is a very long time. And so virtually in every case of people coming up for parole, the commissioners have to find for an exception and see you earlier. So it's essentially a punitive proposal that's designed to deny people parole under the guise of being a victim's rights proposal.
So what we're talking about, Hadar, are these different forces that really profoundly change the way we think about punishment, because it seems like each of these forces contributes to less a view of imprisonment for rehabilitation to back to this idea that we started with, that I quoted from your preface, which is that violent criminals are not redeemable, cannot be rehabilitated, and must be locked away from society for as long as possible. I'm wondering about another force that, whether you think this had an effect too, because you brought up the role of politicians and how difficult it is to say this is a left, right, liberal, conservative thing. But I think for a long time it was thought of as, so-called conservatives were tougher on crime, and a sort of the reverse slogan often made by conservatives, which was that liberals were soft on crime. And I'm thinking back to the Willie Horton episode during the Dukakis campaign, and not only do I think Dukakis never recovered from that, but it seems like Democrats never recovered from that either, and it just became politically impossible to be seen as soft on crime anymore because of how terrible that one story was. And there were racial overtones of that for sure. Lee Atwater, who was George H.W. Bush's campaign manager during that time, later, I think on his deathbed, confessed that he felt a lot of regret about how the Willie Horton story was used, to sow seeds of racial animus. But the idea that you could release someone from prison and that person would turn around and immediately carry out further horrendous violent crimes put a big scare in everybody.
Sure, and in many ways, what happened with the Manson cases is very similar and predictive of what happened with Willie Horton. Because later on, when you see, for example, when you see the move to determinate sentences, or when you see the voter initiative that gives the governor the right to veto a decision to let somebody out, which was a big thing in 1988, it is actually the reason why during the Gray Davis and the Arnold Schwarzenegger administrations, virtually nobody got out. Like, when these things are actually entered into law, when you read the voter pamphlets at the time, you see that it's the Manson family is paraded again and again and again as the cautionary tale.
Yeah. Well, so where did things go? I mean, I love the origin of words. That's kind of one of my pet loves about language. So I really appreciated early on in the book, you talk about the origins of the word parole. And I'll let you tell the story because it's short but a good story about how we come up with this concept.
Sure. So parole comes from the French word that means word, parole. Or parole in Italian. And the idea is that you are essentially giving your guarantee to the prison that you're not going to commit other crimes. And early forms of parole include private citizens, like family members or friends, vouching for you that you're going to stay on the straight and narrow. And it is only much later that parole becomes institutionalized and essentially run by the government.
Right. And like you said from the movie The Shawshank Redemption, the first question is, have you been rehabilitated? Which is another way of saying, have you realized the error of your ways in the past, and do you promise now not to commit those sins, not to commit those crimes anymore? And
Right, right. And what's interesting about this is that the period that's depicted in Shawshank Redemption is a period where mostly you were interested in seeing that the person's not going to become a risk on the outside. And you're talking to them, you're trying to sort of clinically assess whether they've transformed. The people that are on parole boards now in California are very different from the people that were on parole boards in the 50s and 60s. So we've moved away from having professionals on the board, and essentially what we have is political appointees appointed by the governor who almost invariably come from law enforcement backgrounds. So we're talking former sheriffs, former chiefs of police, former correctional officers, and then you entrust them essentially with the sort of the unscientific task of trying to figure out, what's this person like from the inside? Are they good? Should we trust them? And you see this sort of unscientific process in motion when you actually look at the parole transcripts and you see what kind of questions they ask and what they're interested in.
Well, I want to come to that, but just to underscore the point you're making, if you go from those responsible for the decisions of parole being psychologists and therapists, people who come from that background, and instead have political appointees in professions that are devoted to locking people up, locking up bad guys. I mean, you could see how just from that alone it would bring about a big change. So that's fascinating. So you and I know part of the way you approached this research in the book, based on that research, is doing something that very few people have probably ever done, which is you go back and look at the actual transcript from the Manson family parole proceedings. And I mean, obviously you have to read the whole book to find out everything that you learned and found important. But I mean, summarize what you learned going through that process about what are the flaws, or if that's what you'd call them, in the system.
Sure. So yeah, the book is based on 40 years worth of parole hearing transcripts. I have all the transcripts involving the Manson family going back to their first hearings in 1978 to date, basically. And I've read and analyzed all of those transcripts to see what's happening there. Now, the hearing typically is divided into three parts. First, they talk about the crime of commitment, which is the past. Then they talk about the present, which is how the person is doing in prison. And then they talk about the futures and what the person's plans for release are. And in each of those stages, basically what I'm seeing is this move away from just an effort to figure out if the person is a risk or not, to essentially a mentality where you're going to keep the person in, basically unless proven otherwise, and you're going to interpret evidence to imply that the person doesn't have what is known as insight. So insight is the key word in parole hearings. It's heard a lot. This is the big buzzword that starts in the mid-'80s and continues on. And the idea is to sort of try to dig into how the person feels. It's a pretty amorphous concept. It's sort of a combination of having remorse for your crime and also having some sort of understanding of what and who you were when you committed the crime and demonstrate that you're now different, that you've now changed in a meaningful way. So when we talk about the past, people are facing all kinds of difficult dilemmas because if you're told to dig back into the crime of commitment, and by the way, since 2008, it's actually unconstitutional to deny people the right to be paroled just on the basis of the heinousness of the crime. So even if you don't want to let people out because their crime is heinous, you're going to have to find some constitutionally valid way to dress it up.
Okay.
Like, that the heinousness of the crime is somehow like you don't have insight of it or something like that you can't actually, that the person can't really disprove. And that's what I see a lot in the discussions of the past. So what I see is this idea that you have to kind of like keep digging into your insight. If people are portraying their crime in ways that are sort of more ameliorating circumstances, if they try to explain, I was young, it was the 60s, or, really anything that involves anything except taking personal accountability for what you've done, then you're seen as minimizing and not having insight. On the other hand, if you're talking about your crime harshly and you're saying, oh, I was such a bad person, either you come off as insincere or you're just basically underscoring like how monstrous your crime was and how can we let somebody so dangerous get out. Now, from hearing to hearing, you're supposed to provide, because very few people get paroled on the first hearing, and some people, like the people in my book, come up for hearings dozens of times. The thought process of the person coming into their hearing is like this. I was trying to tell them about, my dad and what happened to me in the last hearing. That wasn't enough for insight, so I'm going to have to find something else. I'll have to talk about my mom. And then you see these kind of like deep excavations into the psyche going deeper and deeper, and like how much more can the person not understand about themselves after 40 years of going through this process? And nonetheless, there's always the possibility that you're going to get denied parole because you have no insight.
Or at
Now,
least that's going to be
home,
offered as the basis for denying, even if the
the
person demonstrates even if they demonstrate a lot of insight, they're looking. It's almost like it switches instead of putting the how to say this. Instead of expecting the parole petitioner to come up with a basis, it's really asking the parole board to look for a reason to deny them.
Basically, and they don't have to look really that hard because it's whatever narrative people are going to tell you, you can always ding them for something. Which is another thing that I found in my book, that you can argue something and you can argue exactly the opposite, and both things could be reasons for denial. I mean, the other thing that I find in the past is that not many people know this, but the inmate is in the room. Their family's not allowed to come, so they don't actually have anybody supporting them. They can come with a lawyer, but the lawyers very seldom talk during the process. It's actually pretty bad news if your lawyer has to talk. It means things are not going very well. But the prosecutor is in the room. Sometimes the prosecutor from the original trial, sometimes somebody else from the office comes. And the prosecutor's role has expanded beyond just being there to, just discuss, technical points about the trial, to being what I call in the book the moral memory of the board. So they feel empowered to comment on how dangerous they think these people are, what they think about their character, what they think about their behavior in prison. And this gets added to the Greek chorus of not just the prosecutor, but also the victims that are present in the room. And the number of victims that actually come to these hearings has grown every year, especially since Martys Law. It's really mushroomed. In one of the cases, in Tex Watson's case, I show how it mushrooms from one person to 17 people in the room. And they can talk extensively. They can read letters from other people. People who were not victims of the crime can also be in the room. Notably, Sharon Tate's family. Sharon Tate was, of course, the victim of one of the murders, but they regularly appear to hearings that had nothing to do with the killing of Sharon Tate, and to hearings of people who did not even know that Sharon Tate was murdered at the time. And they appear as victim advocates, or as people that are sort of offering support to the actual victims of the crime. People will show up to the hearings that didn't even know the deceased, like people who were born after the deceased had died will give victim statements. So all of this stuff together creates a pretty artificial environment for anybody who is going to offer insight or remorse. And moreover, there's all these sort of choreography. Title 15, which is the legal place where all the regulations about parole are there. Title 15 doesn't even allow the inmates to directly address the victims. So you're basically sitting there, and the whole scene is contrived so that whatever apology you're going to get out is not going to come out genuine. And nobody in the room is going to read it as genuine. So that's the kind of the aspect of the past, and then of course we have the present and the future. The present being what are your disciplinary based on your central file, which is where all your behavior in prison is documented. What are your disciplinary write-ups? What's the laudatory stuff in your file? What kind of programs were you in? And that is a Kafkaesque circus all unto itself.
So, I mean, I can see how the Mansons, given the extraordinary nature of the crimes, the notoriety of these criminals, still notorious today. I mean, when you see a picture of Charles Manson, even as an old man, I think it was 83 when he died. I don't know. There's something, you talk about the dark caves of his eyes. I mean, there's something still visceral that we experience even at the mention of the name. So I could see how, as from the perspective of the victims, the survivors of victims advocates generally, as well as politicians, I mean, it's just hard to imagine how these guys are ever going to get out of jail, even though they're much older.
It's only hard to imagine if you think about who and what they were 50 years ago, when many of these people were teens or in their early 20s.
Yeah.
This is, by the way, one of the decisions that I made in the course of putting the book together, is that I would not include any footage from the crime scene, any pictures of them as young people, because I think there's plenty of that going around. And what I wanted people is to see what they look like today. So, for example, one of the pictures, I think the most important photo that I've reproduced in the book, is a photo from Susan Atkins' 2009 hearing. So at that point, Susan Atkins is almost 60 years old. She has an inoperable brain tumor, and she's largely unresponsive. She doesn't talk, she doesn't open her eyes, she doesn't move, and she's wheeled into the hearing on a gurney. And at that point, they predicted that a few months later she would die, and her husband, James Whitehouse, who's a Harvard-educated lawyer, is representing her at the hearing, essentially asking to let her go so that she can die with her husband at home. And what you see in the hearing is Deborah Tate, Sharon Tate's sister, essentially kind of pointing at this woman who is unresponsive on a gurney, saying, you can't let her go, she's a risk to public safety. And the way that they talk about the risk that she poses when the person is lying on a gurney unresponsible in the room is really quite astonishing.
It is
the only way to explain.
It's a pretty dramatic photo.
I'm sorry?
It's a pretty dramatic photo. It's on page 200 of the book for people who click the link in the description and get a copy of the book. You'll find it there, and it's pretty telling.
This is one of those situations where a picture really tells, speaks louder than 100 words, and this is one of them. It's when you read the transcript and you read them sort of calmly discussing whether she needs a hearing aid or not based on the ADA when she's sitting there, and it's pretty clear that with 1,000 hearing aids she's not going to hear anything that's going on. It's the hypocrisy is breathtaking.
Well, and you mentioned that we've also, in moving to more political law enforcement-oriented members of parole review boards, you've moved away from data, from statistics. I mean, it's not, I think many people now understand and appreciate that there is pretty solid social science data that shows a sharp decrease in the risk of repeat offenders in terms of violent crimes as they age. I mean, people are much more likely to be associated with a violent crime in their teens and their 20s and their 30s than in their 50s and their 60s, let alone 70s and 80s. I mean, so
sure.
That alone shows you that you're moving away from any kind of individualized assessment. So, what do you come away with? Because this is such a stark picture you're painting that it seems like nobody's getting out on parole. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, are there parts of the country that are still more, I hate to use the word lenient, but more accepting of a process of looking at each individual individually for purposes of parole? Or do you think what you see coming out of the Manson family experience actually is representative of trends throughout the country?
So what I'm told about California, at least, is that most of what I saw is generalizable. Like a lot of the kind of, dinging people for just minute disciplinary offenses that you can't really be 50 years in prison without committing some prison infraction. So dinging people from that is something that's very, very common. One thing that's, I don't know if it's unique to California, but it's certainly not unique to the Mansons, is the fact that the board regularly requires that people attend rehabilitative programs that don't exist. I mean, really, the problem that's underlying all of this is the fact that prison is not a good resource for making people into successful people on the outside. There's very little in the way of programming. In terms of budget, that's always the first thing that gets cut, and that basically dictates everything. It means that, for example, substance abuse programming is reduced to 12 steps, which is something with really questionable rates of success, because that's a cheap thing to do that the inmates do themselves. You don't need professionals, you don't need psychologists, you don't need substance abuse experts to do it. The parole board will regularly just quiz people on the steps, and if they don't know the steps by heart, like they'll ask you, what's the fifth step if you don't know it by heart? That correlates perfectly with parole denial. So we're seeing this stuff again and again, and this is not unique to the Manson family, of course. There are some trends that are a little bit more encouraging. So we're seeing not a lot of recognition of what you said, which is that people age out of violent crime, but we are seeing some understanding that we have to take into account when people were young when they committed the crime. So just recently, I mean, I'm talking, especially to those of us with some legal background about cases like Roper versus Simmons, the case that eliminated the death penalty for juveniles, and then following that Miller versus Alabama, and a lot of cases that are basically recognizing that new information that we have from neuroscience tells us that people's frontal cortex, people's brains continue to grow well into their mid and sometimes late 20s. So children are different from adults.
Well, and eliminating...
And that has to be taken...
Yeah, the Supreme Court eliminated life without parole for minors. That's another case.
Right, mandatory life without parole for minors for exactly this reason.
Yeah.
So one of the ways in which these kind of Miller adjustments are being made, of course, with people who are, haven't been minors for decades now but committed their crime when they were minors or very young, is that the parole board is now allowed to take that into account. And in fact, in 2017, when Leslie Van Houten was finally recommended for parole after so many years, that's what the board said. They said nothing else changed. The only thing that changed is that now he's been required to look at your age, and you are 19 when you committed the crimes. So I mean, she was 19 when she committed the crimes the whole time, but it is only now becoming relevant because of this Supreme Court precedent.
Interesting. Wow.
So that is the thing that is changing for the better, I think, and it's changing not just in California. Is the idea that you can't lock people up for decades interminably for things that they did when they were young. And yet you see these folks that were very young when they committed the crime being recommended for release. Now, 3 of them have been recommended for release, Bruce Davis, Leslie Van Houten, and Bobby Beausoleil, and all 3 were reversed by the governor, both by Jerry Brown and by Gavin Newsom.
Well, we've talked about some of these same issues in other contexts. We've talked about it in regard to sex offenders and extra prison requirements that are placed on sex offenders, like lifetime sex offender registries and things like that. And generally, we talk about prison overcrowding. It's so easy to simplify the conversation on these topics, but what fascinates me about this, and again, it's where we started, is it forces us to think about what are we trying to accomplish? If we say we want to, if we're going to take the view that the purpose of punishment is retributive, which just means we're punishing them to punish them because they deserve it, okay, that's one thing. But it seems we've had a long tradition in this country that recognizes the idea that people can do wrong, even grievous wrong, and they can heal and get better and at some point become productive members of a community again. But if
exactly, and if you're not acknowledging that, then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the purpose of the exercise, right? Because if the purpose of the exercise is to protect public safety, then how much is public safety at risk really from people who are in their 70s?
Well, these are great questions, and for anybody, and that should include everybody, interested in thinking about some of these issues. And for those, in addition, who just can't get enough of reading about the 60s and the really just can't take your eyes away from it story of the Manson family and their crimes. What a great book. Yesterday's Monsters, The Manson Family Cases and the Illusion of Parole by Hadar Aviram. Hadar, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I was right to look forward to this conversation. Both Maddie and I, who's in the studio with me, have been saying for weeks now how excited we were to talk with you, and it's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Same here.